If he's moving from something which is perennial, or at least which he regards as being a perennial, universal in human experience, to considering something which he regards as being, as it were, topical to our age, and for that reason ephemeral, so that in 200 years' time, when we're all dead, this will all be past history and something else will be the case, isn't his philosophy ceasing to be concern itself with the permanent and just concerning itself with the superficial?
Well, if this were any old culture, or even any old stage of our culture, he would say yes, and what he was doing would then be soon passé, as you're saying. But he thinks that this is a very special culture and that we're in a very special stage of this very special culture. It's a special culture for him because we're the only culture that has history. I mean, in any culture, events follow one after another. But only in ours does the understanding of being change from the Greek to the Christian to the modern. And that's historicity in Heidegger language. And we happen to stand in a special place in our culture. An understanding of being that started with Plato 2,000 years ago has gone through all sorts of philosophical and practical transformations until it is now finished in Heidegger terms. That means all the philosophical moves have been tried and played out, completed, and now it's done for. It's a sort of pun on finished. He gets this idea from Nietzsche, who influenced him a lot. We have reached a stage of planetary technology where we are now taking over the whole planet. Our understanding of being is dominating every understanding of being. And our understanding of being has come to a dead end, which Heidegger calls nihilism.
One aspect of the late Heidegger, which we haven't touched on, and we must, I think, before we move on to the thinkers after Heidegger, is his concern with language. The later Heidegger is not just concerned with language, he's almost obsessed by language, isn't he? Why is that?
Well, we're in a way set to see that, because since there's no way the world is in itself, language isn't there to correspond to reality, nor is language there just to be made up arbitrarily. For Heidegger, a vocabulary, or the kind of metaphors one uses, name things into being. When in California somebody said that everybody was laid back, there were already people with hot tubs taking it easy and taking drugs, but now they discovered that that all fitted together and they were laid back, so there was more of it. So language is a marvelously powerful way to change the practices, focus them, and add new practices to Dasein's way of life. So it's the poets, not the philosophers or the priests or the scientists, who are the vanguard of humanity and the hope of some new understanding of being.
Now, I think we've been quite right to devote almost the whole of this discussion to Heidegger, because he is far and away the most important 20th century existentialist philosopher. But I did say in the introduction to this discussion that we would touch on others, and I think we must do so now before we bring the discussion to a close. What I mentioned specifically Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. Let's take them in that order, the chronological order. How would you characterize Sartre's relationship as a philosopher to Heidegger?
Well, Sartre starts out as a Husserlian and becomes a phenomenologist, writes a good novel called Nausea, which is a phenomenological description of a world breaking down. But then he read Heidegger and he was converted to what he thought was Heidegger. But he felt he had to fix up Heidegger as a Frenchman and make it Cartesian. So he starts with the individual subject and tries to get and to talk about death and guilt and all the things that Heidegger talks about. But that's a disaster, because if this story that we've been telling is right, that's what Heidegger was trying to free us from. In fact, when I went to visit Heidegger, he had Being and Nothingness on his desk in German translation. And I said, "Oh, you're reading Sartre?" And he said, "How can I even begin to read this muck?" His word was Dreck. And that's pretty strong, and I think that's accurate, because what happens if you treat Heidegger as if he were talking about subjects is you really push him back to Husserl.
It's difficult to believe, actually, that Sartre will survive as a philosopher at all, though he might survive as a novelist and a playwright. What's your view of Merleau-Ponty?
I'm very much more impressed with Merleau-Ponty. I think he's a great philosopher and will survive. His great contribution was to bring in the body as our way of being in the world. There are two big gaps in being in time. One of them is that Heidegger never talks about the body, or even about skills or practices. I put all that in to explain the ready-to-hand and the understanding of being. Now, Merleau-Ponty, because he does talk about the body, and it's the body that acquires skills, he answers Sartre, for one thing. He says we're not free. We're restricted by having the same sort of bodies everyone has, and by the fact that what we do becoming habits in our bodies and skills in our bodies, which we're not arbitrarily free to change. And this both answers Sartre, and in a way, oddly enough, Merleau-Ponty, answering Sartre, who was like Husserl, reinvents Heidegger, but filling in the gaps. The other gap is perception. Heidegger talks about perception as if it was just staring at things. And that is unfortunate, because it does seem as if we spend a lot of time not only using things, but seeing things. But Merleau-Ponty has an analysis of perception as a embodied activity in which we move to get an optimal grip on things, which makes it more of the ready-to-hand, thereby completing the Heidegger picture.
Now, all of the four named philosophers that we've been discussing, Husserl, Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, they're all dead. Sartre only recently dead. Do you regard this whole tradition of philosophy that we've been talking about as something that's now closed, or do you regard it as very much an alive and ongoing enterprise?
I think it's very much alive. Even the phenomenology, the Husserl side, which Heidegger was trying to kill off, is very much alive. The Husserl is alive in two ways. One is that if you want to describe the phenomena, what it's like to listen to music, what it's like to have sexual desire, any phenomenon, Husserl gives you a license to do it and a method for doing it.
And we have young philosophers in Britain who are doing precisely that sort of thing now.
And in the United States, too.
Yes.
The other side of Husserl is, if anything, even more alive and active. Namely, he was interested in the structure of the intentional content, of that in the mind that enables us to refer to things. Now there's something called cognitive science, actually trying to investigate empirically the structure of our mental representations, as they would say. And Husserl has laid down the general guidelines that anybody doing that investigation will follow. Or if you're trying to build a mind, as people using computers and artificial intelligence are doing, Husserl is also the father of artificial intelligence. Many of his ideas that the mind follows hierarchies of strict rules are now being cashed out into computer programs. So Husserl's doing fine. Heidegger's doing fine, too. Early Heidegger, Being and Time, is not perhaps as much followed now as it should be. I'm using it. The way I use it is as I've been using it here. If you actually get back to the phenomena of our engaged everyday activity, you can criticize the linguistic analysts who either trust their intuitions or trust our linguistic categories. Heidegger would say, and I think a description of skills shows it, that if you trust our intuitions, you talk always about beliefs, desires, and so forth, and that's not an adequate description of what's normally going on. It's only a breakdown description. And likewise, we talked about how our language mirrors not the everyday coping, but the breakdown. So there, Heidegger phenomenology gives us a good point for criticizing some unquestioned assumptions of contemporary Anglo-American philosophy. And finally, in Europe now, particularly in France, later Heidegger is the great father of those who want to, as he already put it, deconstruct the tradition. For instance, Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida are trying to follow out the Heidegger project of defining exactly what our understanding of being is in order to help us get over it. So I would say that there is hardly any area of intellectual activity these days in which the concerns of these thinkers don't play a large role.
Well, thank you very much for that, Professor Dreyfus.